the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we do have a Patreon account that we wanted to mention at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. Today, Taylor and I will be joined by Matt Bauer, currently senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at Texas State University, my alma mater. Matt completed his PhD work at the University of Memphis, and he got his bachelor's also in philosophy at Beloit College, or Beloit. What's the pronunciation here?
Beloit.
Beloit, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
His area of specialization is post-Kantian European philosophy, particularly as it bears on topics like philosophy of mind and perception. He's published a number of articles about Husserl's genetic phenomenology, some attempting to explain Husserl's method and theoretical ambitions in doing genetic phenomenology, and others examining its relation to developmental psychology and as a way to understand the embeddedness of intersubjectivity in perceptual experience. He's published some articles as well, exploring the phenomenology of Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and Levinas. But even more important than all of that, Matt is probably the most outstanding philosophy poster and memer on Twitter.
I'll take it.
I'll give you that crown above myself just because your stuff is like way more sophisticated. So congratulations. We usually like to start these off, Matt, by asking our guests to give what we've been referring to as their philosophical origin story, whatever direction you want to take it in. But if it helps, maybe an encounter with a thinker, a book, a movie, a class you took, something like that kind of stands out and kind of puts you on this journey. And if you want to extend that to Husserl and your other, specific interests and maybe to today's discussion.
That's a great question. And thanks for having me on. Great to talk with you guys. So my origin story, I think really, I had been reading philosophy in high school a bit, but as an undergrad, what really hooked me was reading the British empiricists, especially Berkeley and Hume. Reading those guys, I kind of got the feeling of a philosophy I could really see myself doing. It's very experiential. The test of Hume and Berkeley is always try it out for yourself. Test my observations against your own ability to reflect on your experience. That really hooked me, but at the same time, I was kind of hung up on the typical kinds of dissatisfactions that people have with early modern philosophy of veering into skepticism and potentially solipsism. And I shortly after that had my first encounter with Heidegger's Being and Time and Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. I don't think I understood them exactly, but I felt like, hey, these guys are doing something that, well, at least with Merleau-Ponty, is his fixation on perception. This is doing something kind of like the British empiricism that initially got me hooked, but seeming to avoid the skeptical conclusions and the solipsism, all of that sort of thing. And then from there, it was a little while, wasn't until grad school that I finally got into Husserl and got taken especially with, it was kind of a two-part thing. First of all, his logical investigations, just the account of intentionality and the fifth logical investigation really seemed to supply a lot of things that were lacking in the kind of account that you get from British empiricists of sensory experience. Much more complex and rich account, not just kind of sense data and dim ideas flowing through your head. Since then, Husserl's been the one that I've largely orbited around, although still maintaining a healthy interest in Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Heidegger. To connect it to today and what we want to talk about, we're going to be looking at that piece from that volume, Husserl at the Limits of Phenomenology, and that essay in particular, Foundational Investigations of the Phenomenological Origin of the Spatiality of Nature, etc. This is a piece that reflects his genetic turn when he's practicing genetic phenomenology. And that's really like what I ended up focusing on in my dissertation and so on. I've become increasingly interested in Merleau-Ponty, having discovered that in his kind of like mid to later period, he really starts to incorporate a lot of ideas from Husserl's genetic phenomenology. There's a whole volume, Institution and Passivity, that's centered around his attempt to kind of take these concepts and expand them. And although lots of people will recognize Husserl's kind of genetic period of the crisis and all of that, like that's the most attractive aspect of his philosophy. Nevertheless, like pretty much nobody took up the banner of genetic phenomenology and ran with it. So Merleau-Ponty is kind of the main guy to do that. That's from my beginnings to here today.
It's kind of funny because I think Hume was one of my early interests in philosophy, but I was attracted to the solipsism and skepticism more so, unsurprisingly so.
Which is why you found Stirner.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
It didn't bother you so much. In retrospect, yeah, I'm not so concerned about skepticism or solipsism.
I guess I kind of had so I had some exposure, like very limited, kind of early on undergrad days. I was just like reading, Introduction to Nietzsche, blah, like those little comic book style intro books. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. I still have some of them actually.
Yeah.
I'll come about this.
So I had this kind of very like cursory idea of like postmodernism, what have you, that sort of fit this sort of skepticism of Hume to some degree, or there was like some kind of truck there that I found interesting. But I also kind of like the empirical aspect. I mean, I remember getting into an argument with one of my friends. He was kind of like arguing the Platonic side. And I was like, no, man, you gotta actually be in the world doing shit to develop knowledge, yada, yada.
I remember my intro to philosophy class the first philosophy class that I took in undergrad. The professor was a Husserl scholar, right? And she didn't assign any Husserl because it was mainly focused on existentialism. So we did read a little bit of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and I do remember using, and I don't know why, because it wasn't necessarily talked about in class, but I remember using the term intersubjectivity. One of the only comments I remember from that class was kind of like, don't use words you don't know what they mean. And I was like, fuck. And it's funny because, like in the piece we read for today, which we also read alongside, or I thought we were going to, The Origins of Geometry, he does obviously elaborate a theory of intersubjectivity. And so I think that she very much, as a Husserlian, was like, you got to walk before you start running, sweetie. Like, my sweet summer child, you don't know, you have no idea what you're talking about. But that's fair.
That's so Husserlian, the way that on his account, there's kind of like a layering of phenomenological concepts, and intersubjectivity is fairly downstream of the elementary ones. Like if you look at the Cartesian meditations, for instance, it's 5 different meditations, and it's the 5th one, the very last one, where he comes around and talks about intersubjectivity.
And that's the one that Levinas translated, and that kind of he's famous for developing in his own way in Totality and Infinity and Beyond Being. But specifically, I remember there being a lot of literature and interest in Levinas's translation of the 5th meditation, right? Because how can you even begin talking about the face of the other, and the height of God appearing in the face without a deep-seated sort of rootedness in that 5th meditation? I guess that makes sense why Levinas is another, among the thinkers that you're researching. But I will say, when I use that term, I wasn't even thematizing it or conceptualizing it. And I think that really was her beef. I think it was a kind of like a throwaway term that maybe I had osmotically picked up somewhere. And so it didn't really need to be there or wasn't really doing anything. And that's just part of the process that you learn when you do have good teachers that don't let you get away with bullshit. you get called out on it. And I remember that thinking, at the very least, and I may not have always followed it, but thinking, I'm going to be a little bit more careful in the future with how I sort of craft my statements and avoid using terms you don't know how to use.
If we have you on again in the future, we'll have to do some Levinas, because interestingly, I recall that we did an episode we've done two with Graham Harman, but in the first one, he was talking about how Levinas is a great philosopher of jouissance, unexpectedly.
Yeah, enjoyment.
So that could be a little connection.
That's the idea that really kind of inspired me when I did a little bit of writing about Levinas. It was exactly that, because like a lot of my research is about philosophy of perception, and you hear about Levinas, it's mostly like centers on the issue of the face, the
ethics, stuff like that.
Ethics. But nobody talks about Levinas as like making significant contributions to how we understand perceptual experience. But he's got like in Totality and Infinity and other writings everywhere where he talks about sensory experience. Really fascinating things to say, that there's a lot of convergence among phenomenologists in what they want to say about perceptual experience. Sometimes it's a bit of a family resemblance thing, that they're not exactly the same. But Levinas really strikes out in his own direction in how he thinks about sensory experience. The Husserlian kind of starting point has the notion of intentionality running the show. And intentionality comes with all these metaphors of aiming, this unidirectional from me to the world grasping thing. And Levinas, one of the things that he wants to stress is not just the passivity of sensory experience, that it's a thing that happens to me, but it's a reciprocal thing. Merleau-Ponty does appreciate that, like up to a point. He has some resemblances with Levinas here, but I'd love to talk Levinas. That'd be fun.
I mean, I'm not going to explain this. Apologies for doing this without explaining it, but I think even there's some ethical, maybe I don't know if I'd say overlap per se, but I don't know. There's an interesting dialogue with Levinas's ethics and Stirner, just to throw that in your lap without any context. But go ahead, Taylor.
I've been pushing Coop to do Totality and Infinity for a couple of years now, and eventually, it's been on the back burner. But I do remember when we did Sartre's Transcendence of the Ego, one of his axioms is like looking at phenomenology, and he's kind of saying traditionally we've always thought of consciousness as consciousness of something, and starts like, but consciousness is something, right? And like where he goes from that. And again, the starting point being intentionality, I think, was my main sort of hook to what you were saying.
Maybe I should read this first little bit of text, because I don't know, this is from early on in the first chapter, from the foundational investigations of the phenomenological origin. The earth is not the whole of nature. It is one of the stars in the infinite space of the world. The earth is a spherical body, certainly not perceivable in its wholeness all at once and by one person. Rather, it is perceived in a primordial synthesis as a unity of mutually connected single experiences. Yet it is a body, although for us it is the experiential ground for all bodies in the experiential genesis of our representation of the world. This ground is not experienced at first as body, but becomes a corporeal ground at higher levels of constitution of the world by virtue of experience, and that nullifies its primordial form of the ground. It becomes the total body, the carrier of all bodies that, until now, could be fully normally experienced with empirical sufficiency on all sides as they are experienced, provided that the stars are not to be regarded as bodies. But now the Earth is a huge block on which smaller bodies exist, and on the basis of which they also have become, and could have become, for us by division into fragments or by separating them off from the whole.
That's such a great passage. It really captures
it's awesome.
Like everything that he wants to say in a nutshell. That would be like a perfect abstract for this particular piece. Part of the reason I picked it is because of the kind of wild, speculative character this has for Husserl. We maybe have this image of Husserl as being this really straight-laced guy who wants to talk about logic and science, and maybe although we know he's critical of some extensions of science and how we understand the world from what he says in The Crisis. Nevertheless, this one seems to be kind of out of left field. One of the tagline, the subtitle of this piece includes his bold statement, "The earth does not move." And he means it as an anti-Copernican gesture, right? The Copernican theory introduced the idea that the earth is just one object among infinitely many others with all the same properties as those others. It's not the center of the world around which everything else revolves, the immobile center of the world. And weirdly, Husserl seems to be saying, in some sense here, that the pre-Copernican view is the correct one, the more fundamental one, and that in some sense we've got to reject the Copernican view. Really kind of bizarre sounding claims. And not only that, but like this text is published in the larger volume that's a set of lectures by Merleau-Ponty, where he talks about this little piece by Husserl. And the natural question comes up, like, what does Merleau-Ponty think about this exactly? And the answer is signs off on it 100%. Like he's rooting for Husserl here. In the preface to the Merleau-Ponty volume by Len Lawler, he points out that there's a connection between this set of lectures and another one that Merleau-Ponty gives at about the same time that's published just a couple of years ago as The Possibility of Philosophy. And early on in that work, let me pull it up. This is on page 13 of that volume. He says, the access to other planets does not relativize the Earth and does not make a corpor, that is a body, out of the others, but on the contrary, that such access extends to other planets the function of a pre-objective Boden or ground. The other planets become annexes of Earth, or the Earth expands, but one is always someplace. For example, the encounter with other thinking beings, and so on and so forth. He's trying to say there, like, the Earth is a kind of privileged metaphysical, privileged center of the world that we experience. And that when Husserl says it doesn't move, like, he's ready to sign off on that.
Just to try to reach into your interests in this, so to speak, turn in Husserl towards genetic phenomenology. The way I'm understanding it, and there are hints dropped along the way, I won't go through all of them, but one is found in the very last paragraph of this piece, where he sort of reasserts it's the fact that the ego, we have to understand that sort of, I suppose, in the sense of eidetic reduction, right? It's the ego that is the constituting factor in any phenomenological inquiry. And so in a certain sense, in the way in which the world grounds our experience in the same way the ego, or he'll use the term flesh, also is this grounding center that, in the sense in which we could sort of hypothetically in a thought experiment step outside ourselves and think of ourselves as a body moving, but insofar as we compose one flesh qua ego, that center doesn't itself move. It is the ground from whence to like base the relativity of movements and rest. And so we can only really speak inexactly to talk about the flesh moving or even resting, because it's not in that system of coordinates of mobility. I guess the question being, is this part of the genetic element? That last paragraph almost seems like it could be taken as an aside, right? Reasserting the kind of, if you will, the strong correlation of the constitutive core of our ego in experience. Is it the genetic element, this genetic turn, that is prompting him to state what you called a pre-Copernican statement? Because I do think that if it is pre or anti-Copernican at the same time, we don't go back to Ptolemy. There's still, obviously we live in a post-Copernican world, and yet he says, like, we moderns, we Copernicans have to grapple with the fact that we don't necessarily take everything. If we base ourselves in genetic phenomenology, we have to push back against certain tenets of what has been bequeathed to us from the Copernican revolution. Hopefully that sort of made some sense.
This passage, like the one that you point to at the very end, is a super important one for lots of reasons. And like you say, like, or to respond to your question, this does tie in really importantly with how this is supposed to be a genetic account, because he wants to say that our first and initial and fundamental experience of the world is the earth is as something other than a body, and that you have to go through a whole lot of transformations, a whole historical process to generate the idea of the earth as a body. And in some instances, there's a kind of continuity to genetic development. When he talks in the fifth meditation about the kind of origin of the experience of the other as an other, it takes place through what he calls a transference of sense. There's a pairing.
He used that same phrase in this piece, right?
Yeah. And it's really important because what he wants to say here is he wants to contrast the origin of the experience of the other with the origin of the experience of the earth as a body by saying that there's a kind of rupture between the experience of the earth as a body and the experience of it as a ground, as he says, that doesn't exist in the emergence of the experience of the other. Because I straightforwardly transfer to the other the sense of what it means to be a subject from myself to the other. That's his story anyway. But Husserl says there is no transference of meaning and sense from experiencing the earth as a ground to experiencing it as a body.
This isn't a word he uses, but is this a way when we assert in modern physics that the earth is a body, is this what he might call, from the point of view of genetic phenomenology, an abstraction? Or can we I know he doesn't use that term, but I'm trying to process a term for what he might say, because we see in the quote that Coop read, yes, it is a body. And yet that's merely from the factualism of what he's critiquing, which is a kind of historicism in the sciences, which for him isn't truly historical enough, I think. I'm trying to, just thinking about the origins of geometry essay for a second there, where I think the polemic is much more pointed. There is a certain historicism that wants to ground itself in facts rather than think about the way in which those facts, ready-made, pre-given, have to go through a whole series of transformations or transference, as we said earlier, of sense, right? I think that the visual metaphor he uses, if it works, he talks about there's like a flowing stasis. And when he used that, I can only really understand it in I'm not going to say metaphor, in the image, if you will, of sedimentation. There's a layering, a progressive layering of, let's say, psychical investigations that has to go in through a historical process that actually would finally accrue to something like the ideality of the objects of geometry. I was trying to explain this to Cooper earlier, where like Husserl wants to talk about ideal objects that aren't merely psychical. They're not just in our heads. That's what I think one of the things he's trying to get at with the origins of geometry is it's not just little facts or axioms that are mere products of the psyche. Even if obviously psychical life was necessary for developing this throughout history and bequeathing us with geometry as we know it today through this sedimentation, it's not sufficient, right? There's something that can't be reduced to psychical investigations, because that doesn't really get us to the trans-individual historical acquisitions that we have. And I see something similar going on here, where that the genetic account forecloses reducing the earth to a body, because it actually forecloses the very basis of how we experience the life world, to use one of his big terms again. I'm obviously being sort of very broad and parenthetical, but I'm trying to fill in a little bit of the gaps.
That's a good way of describing what he's up to here in this text. And it raises so many questions of, okay, he's saying that the earth doesn't move. So that appears to be a contradiction of the Copernican view, which says the earth does move. You got to like, either one of these is true and the other one has to go. Like you can't have it both ways. Of course, from the Copernican point of view, they might say, well, so maybe you experience the earth in a way that it doesn't appear as a body, but this is an illusion that's corrected by the scientific point of view. And then the direction this takes us is, okay, like, where does Husserl stand exactly when he makes this claim? Does he want to kind of pull the same move on the Copernican point of view as they would turn on him? Does he want to say that the idealization that allows us to think of the earth as a body, that's a subjective projection? It's complicated because he doesn't say much about the Copernican point of view. He's mostly talking about what it means to experience the earth as a ground rather than a body. And just about all he says about the Copernican view of the earth as a body is that it depends on a notion of motion that is completely relative, that there's no fixed point of reference that all things move in relation to. So he says that, and he says that to acquire that perspective on the world, you have to abstract away from the existence of any living or perceiving beings that would introduce that kind of centered point of view. And that's it.
And again, that's why that last paragraph isn't just an afterthought. It very well could have come at the beginning of the essay, but it comes at the end and interesting. So it seems like an afterthought, but it's actually essential to everything that's been discussed before.
Yeah, absolutely. And Merleau-Ponty, in his commentary on this, highlights that. And he says, well, it kind of looks like through most of the text that Husserl's actually moving away from his transcendental idealism. And then he points to this last paragraph and he says, okay, but then here he says, we're still doing transcendental idealism. And his thought about this is that he's overworked the notion of constitution and consciousness, and that he can't really say the things that he wants to say in the body of the text and also affirm what he says in this final paragraph. I think he's got lots of reasons for wanting to say that. One quick one to point to is that you had mentioned earlier how there's the comparison of the earth functioning as a ground, and so that motion is defined relative to it, and the experience of the body also as a point of orientation around which things move.
And I think it's good to say maybe flesh instead of saying the body, only because we are talking about the earth not being a body. But anyway.
Yes, exactly. No, I'm glad you said that. Yeah, we have to make a distinction. Vibe, that's the flesh or the lived body, versus corpor, that's the body as viewed from the physicalistic point of view.
Right.
And that distinction parallels the earth as ground, earth as Boden, versus earth as a body, one like any other. Why I think this is interesting for Merleau-Ponty is that that kind of decenters the significance of the subject or consciousness in structuring the field of experience and the world around us. And he mentioned not only that, there's this really interesting paragraph where he says, oh yeah, by the way, and there's a whole network of things that come along with this. There's the sky. You can't understand the sense of the earth is relative to the sense of the sky. And also the horizon, not in the usual sense that Husserl uses it, but as the vanishing point, that line in the distance where things recede to. All of these things kind of go together. And it's not like we project those onto them. It's almost like there's an autonomy of sense making outside of the subject. And I think that's why Merleau-Ponty is how are you saying all of this stuff? And at the end, you close it with, oh, and by the way, all of this is the result of absolute transcendental constitutional consciousness.
Yeah. That's a good point, that there does seem to perhaps be a little bit of a tension. Or it's as though Husserl in this thought experiment, the thought experiment ends, and yet we have to sort of append this notion of the constitutive ego. and that all of these phenomena don't necessarily precede the ego. The ego precedes it. That's why it's constitution. That does seem to be, we can just call it a tension. I don't necessarily know if it's a contradiction, but it's definitely a tension. And I think that one of the things that Husserl is doing, and you can correct me on this, and this is, again, very sort of broad strokes, but he is always sort of trying to, interestingly enough, going back to these origins and trying to like ground, in its own sense, his transcendental idealism, right? He's constantly trying to like rework his system. All the memes about completing the system of German idealism, there is this sense of completing the system of transcendental idealism, right? So there is a sense in which the very last chapter or paragraph is this: how do these reflections go into the grounding of this genetic phenomenology? How are we to secure the basis? Maybe that's why he is constantly worried about where to begin, because that's a delicate question in philosophy, as we know, right? Where to begin in philosophy, with what image of thought and whatnot.
That is very much on display in this reading. In some ways, it's uncharacteristic of Husserl, and part of what's fun and really like stimulating about reading it is his constant use of examples. Like at one point, he's saying, "Okay, but now I'm in a car, I'm in a train, I turn into a bird, and I'm flying.
I'm a bird, yeah. Mm-hmm. Or I'm on a interstellar spaceship, or I'm on a ship at sea, right?
Or I'm on a planet looking at another planet. Like, what's going on there?" To go back to what you're saying about like the starting point, it's like here he's maybe more often than he's putting into practice his motto to the things themselves. Sometimes he loses touch. I won't be the first person to have said this, with the holding his ideas accountable to their subject matter in this really concrete way.
I will say, I guess, another thing that connects the origins of geometry with this, I briefly restated this question of historical sedimentation of the sciences, and even he includes philosophy at the end. But geometry is the example that he's really looking at. And I stressed how it's not merely a psychical phenomenon. It's not just something in our heads. But I think that it's interesting how the very beginning of this essay on the originary arc, he's trying to talk about in kind of similar terms how just as we don't intuit, we don't experience the earth as a body, even getting to that point of thinking about the earth in this way, as I mentioned, in this abstract way, requires this historical sedimentation, development, and intersubjective, trans-individual communalization of knowledge. So I think that's why I was trying to say it was abstract, even if it is the outcome of concrete labors in the sciences. I think maybe that's part of the interesting paradox that Husserl is trying to get at by asserting that the earth doesn't move, contra Copernicus and the received knowledge that we have, again, inherited.
Yeah, because if you do the example I was kind of jokingly giving about this naive empiricism, like you would wind up with the flat earth revolution, right? Like, you know what I mean? If you're just strictly going off experiential, again, naive empiricism, it would sort of make sense. There's nothing illogical making that deduction, I think.
Yeah, you'd collapse the horizon and the ground into one sort of self-evidence.
Right. And so in that first paragraph, he points to, you're just one little dot, which I almost want to say, like, this is kind of like a Leibnizian or Spinoza. You're like the little singularity on the celestial body. But I know that's contra what Husserl's doing, or Merleau-Ponty rather, or both perhaps.
The point about abstractions is really important. I think it gets at what maybe excites Merleau-Ponty the most here.
Okay.
That, like, a phenomenological analysis, like, would not be like kind of, I open my eyes and like I'm on the surface of the earth and I look out before me and the ground is flat. And then so like I have to say, well, shoot, I guess my intuitive experience of the world is that it's flat. So like now Husserl has not only the earth doesn't move, but the earth is flat. He doesn't do that because the sense of an experience isn't determined completely at the moment that it happens, but there are like what Merleau-Ponty likes to say lateral connections.
Mhm.
And this is more emphasized in the essay The Origin of Geometry than it is in The Earth Doesn't Move, but it's there too. That not only are there the interconnections of my experience traversing the earth, but of all of the people that I can communicate my experience to. It's even more hyped up or perhaps accentuated in The Origin of Geometry. Husserl says it couldn't be the accomplishment of an individual to contemplate a geometrical truth in all objectivity. There had to have been a history tracing back to people's practical dealings with things that eventually produces written communication in particular. It's only because of my connection to the institution of writing and that practical origin that I'm able to have a relationship with these geometrical idealities. And so like Merleau-Ponty's like, there's a big shift here in Husserl. You had in the early Husserl this act, noesis noema, correlation. That was what it was all about. But now it's all about these lateral relations over time, across time, between people, between all of my various experiences. Those seem to do a lot of the weight of determining what I can experience and how the world shows up for me.
Yeah, and obviously the reliance on writing as a technology that allows for this sedimentation is what piques Derrida's interest, gets him to write about this. I don't necessarily want to, that's like its whole episode on its own, but it became clear reading that essay what would interest Derrida and the search for origins, which of course he wants to complicate. But even, I mean, Husserl isn't necessarily searching for the origins of geometry. He's kind of hypothesizing about them. And to a certain extent, then there is not necessarily a disagreement going on. There is a constant deferral, because one of the objections he addresses is one from historicism, which would be wanting to find like the prototype, the historical prototype. Like in philosophy, we might point back to Greece, insofar as the history of philosophy is rooted in the Western tradition, right? We go back to Greece and say, oh, well, there was Thales. He's the first to make this metaphysical pronouncement about being water and making this equation that goes beyond a kind of mythical or religious type of pronouncement. So that's where philosophy starts. And Husserl kind of objects to this need for there to be this legendary hero of geometry that sort of first drew a circle on the sand or some shit, right? I think for him, that type of search is a false problem and misunderstands the type of trans-historical, trans-individual phenomenon. I shouldn't use that word, God. Occurrence or whatever. Just this is why I think the image of the sedimentation is important, that layering. And I guess that gets to the lateral aspect that Merleau-Ponty is interested in, right?
Yeah, totally. I was going to pick up the Derrida thread.
Oh, yeah, sure.
The historicism issue, that's a really big one to bring up here in relation to genetic phenomenology. Because one of the things that seems weird about what Husserl's doing compared to like in later Husserl and these texts, at least in genetic phenomenology, that seems in tension or at odds with the early Husserl, is that from the period of the logical investigations, he was known as a Platonist of sorts.
Okay.
And he even accepted it, like with qualifications. And in the logical investigations, he's very explicit in ruling out the relevance of genetic considerations for he's up to. Only at that time, he thinks of genetic considerations as being causal. So they could only be studied by natural science. The real breakthrough that enables this genetic phenomenology is to recognize that Genesis can be not merely a causal thing, but an intentional thing. He has here intentional and kind of an expanded sense of these lateral connections that we were just talking about. He's really charting a middle path between in extreme logicism or Platonism that would say anything that we want to figure out in philosophy, we don't factor in time or cause and effect or anything like that, or change or history. All of that's irrelevant. How an idea came into being has nothing to do with its legitimacy or how we should understand it. And then the other extreme of like a historicism that would totally ground the meaning and validity of our ideas and theories in their historical emergence, and at the same time relativize them so that there's not like one sense uniting the historical process, but different senses over time. And Husserl wants something that's kind of like intermediate between that. He wants to recognize that the sense of the concepts in modern natural science are a historical product, and that their legitimacy depends on there being a historical product. So that historical connection is really important for him. But at the same time, a little bit like the historicist, he wants to say, we don't talk about the earth in a univocal, uniform way. There's the earlier, the more fundamental ground experience of talking about the earth. And then there's this one that's built on top of it. And they're distinct when I talk about the earth as a body versus earth as a ground. If you look at, like, again, coming back to Merleau-Ponty, if you look at his text, The Prose of the World, that's another one that's like, so that's from the early 50s. So a few years before what we're looking at when Merleau-Ponty comes to this text, The Earth Doesn't Move. There, he points to this as one of the things that most attracts him to Husserl's later philosophy. They're splitting the difference between extreme logicism and extreme historicism.
I mean, I enjoy the reading, but I don't know if that I have takes really per se. I mean, the only thing I'd even be able to contribute would be like if we were trying to bridge this into some comparative discussions of like how Deleuze and Guattari would talk about the earth as a body or as a machine or something like that. I don't know if that's worth even delving into.
I don't know. I think that could be a cool connection to make.
If you recall in Anti-Oedipus, for the primitive territorial machine, when they start going into the anthropology and ethnography chapter, it's if in the despotic regime there is the despot as the body without organs, and obviously if in quote unquote civilized man it's capital, it's the body of capital. In the primitive territorial machine, it's the earth that is the great unengendered body without organs that appropriates surplus value, if you will. And I think that in the sense in which the body without organs is considered unengendered, there's almost something strangely akin to saying it doesn't move. Even if science says, well, the accretion of the Earth's crust, 5.6 or 4.3 billion years ago, and however long ago the Earth became a body, right? If we speak in terms of corpuscles.
Right. There's sedimentation as well could work there, right?
Yeah. So
accretion.
But insofar as we consider a body without organs, it is the great sort of unengendered. It does not have this origin in physical chronological time. That's where it's a different type of logic, obviously, that we're discussing.
That's actually a really good connection because, like, if you squint, there is an affinity between that kind of approach to thinking about the earth and what Husserl and Merleau-Ponty are up to. Mm-hmm. I think that they both want to say that, well, they both want to push back against this view of nature and the natural world and the universe as kind of flattened into one mode of being that ultimately can be explained in physicalistic terms. And they want to say, like, no, perhaps there are different kinds of being. This is Merleau-Ponty stresses that, and Husserl, that what they're pushing back against is the picture of the universe as all homogeneous, that everything can be reduced kind of one schema for understanding things, and to point to, hey, no, like there's the lived body, that is a different kind of thing. It's not reducible to the others. There's the earth is the ground, there's the sky, all of this kind of stuff.
It is interesting to think about. Deleuze considers Kant and Hegel to be enemies, and I would say you could probably throw in Heidegger there too. Even though he never calls Heidegger an enemy, the one thing that he finds interesting that Heidegger does is the way in which he practices the history of philosophy in a novel way. Say, not obviously in a way that Hegel might see it as a kind of teleological outcome of conflicting doctrines that get synthesized. which is why you can play off Fichte and Schelling and sort of stand on their shoulders and proclaim a kind of victory. Heidegger's reactivation, obviously, so much of it does go through a kind of etymological, we could even say Huxlerism. There are kernels of truth in the etymological excavations, but from the strict standpoint of philology, they're perhaps offensive and maybe just wrong. But as for the possibilities of giving birth to concepts and creativity in philosophy from a philosophical point of view, there's not necessarily something objectionable outright. And I think that that's what Deleuze finds interesting in Heidegger. With Husserl, Husserl's one of those interesting figures that is neither an enemy nor necessarily a friend, but he does come into play at various points in Deleuze's work. And I think one of the reasons is merely biographical insofar as, Deleuze in the 40s is inspired by something like Being in Nothingness and sort of devours it over a weekend, and so sees in that early Sartre before the Existentialism as a Humanism lectures, he sees a sort of an interesting path. And I think that that's a biographical element. But the other element is in Logic of Sense, where Husserl does provide means by which to think through the static and dynamic genesis of sense. And I think that perhaps was what I was also trying to key in on, specifically in the Origins essay, the Origin of Geometry essay, where we are thinking, but it comes up too in the ARC essay, in the Earth Does Not Move essay, because it is this question of, one of the little screenshots Coop had there, I guess put in by the editors, was when Husserl's talking about transference, he is talking about this transference of sense. And so that gives this dynamic, there you go, it again puts at the heart of the question not merely the kind of individualistic subject, but this trans-historical, trans-individual subject of history, right? When he says ego at the end, he's already thinking, because he does replay in this essay a little bit of what you mentioned in the fifth meditation. He does replay a little bit about this notion of, insofar as my flesh is this grounding center for me and does not move, there is a transference of sense in understanding the other person as an ego, as also similarly sort of concentrated in their flesh. And that is where a kind of transcendental we arises.
The connection with Sartre and with Heidegger are good ones for trying to fruitfully reflect on affinities between Deleuze and Husserl. Like on the one hand, my Deleuze isn't so great, but I think one of the things that he appreciates in Sartre is the asubjective character, I suppose, of so especially what you get in the transcendence of the ego. And this has some connection that I can't speak to more specifically to Deleuze's idea of a plane of immanence.
Yeah, the impersonal transcendental field. Yes.
Yeah. When Merleau-Ponty talks about the lateral dimension at work in Husserl, it's not exactly pre-subjective because it is produced by acts of subjects, but not in the way that subjects are presented with something and impose a meaning on it. It happens between their acts and over time, and as this kind of implicit process. And Husserl even when he talks about the historical a priori, it almost sounds kind of like this is in the Origin of Geometry, kind of like something that sweeps over humanity and that we're caught up in more so than something that we act on to produce with some kind of conscious awareness. It's doing a lot of the work of enabling and making sense happen without our active intervention. So Merleau-Ponty will say what's interesting about this is that it's the kind of sweep of history through humanity that we're caught up in is not exactly active or passive. It's not purely something that happens to us or something that we do. That's something that kind of busts those categories open.
It's capital constructing itself from the future.
The history of philosophy point too, that you said, like how Deleuze appreciates Heidegger, perhaps not like so much in the content of the things that Heidegger has to say, but in his, let's say, creative approach to the history of philosophy.
Yeah.
That you get something very much like that in The Origin of Geometry. And you pointed this out too, that in The Origin of Geometry, we don't want to go back to the historical Thales of geometry. That's not important. There's something idealizing and abstract about these kinds of reflections. And you'll notice that that essay is about the origin of geometry, which he doesn't think of as a philosophical enterprise. But this is something that Merleau-Ponty stresses kind of almost as a casual side remark in The Origin of Geometry. Husserl says, oh, and by the way, what I'm doing here and talking about geometry, this would be how we would approach philosophy and the history of philosophy too. We want to come to an understanding of our philosophical activities. We would similarly need to place ourselves on this kind of historical plane where the sense of our thinking is rooted in this much bigger horizon.
I think this is the tension in Deleuze and trying to, on the one hand, there's almost like, there's like this parabola, if you will. There are these asymptotes because he's, on the one hand, in his last work with Guattari in What is Philosophy, you brought it up, you mentioned the plane of immanence. I mean, he's trying to think through sort of metaphilosophically the continuity of the tradition, and yet creation also within each philosophy happens through these discontinuities by creating with, and for Deleuze, it's these artistic kind of images of collage, portraiture, theater, right? Where mobilizing the creativity of philosophy is done in these types of ways. And so I think that there's a sense in which I think he's trying to think through not just he's trying to think through the sedimentation of the history of philosophy in a way that doesn't lock us into any one stratum. You know, to use that terminology, you know, that's a Thousand Plateaus shit from the third plateau, which is about like the earth in a certain way. But if the assemblage is like one side is facing the strata and this sedimentation, there's another side facing the bottom without organs that implies a kind of infinite variation, or at least the possibility thereof. So like, I think that that's where, if Deleuze were to look at what Husserl is doing, there's a sense in which, yes, we do sort of inherit the history of philosophy as a sedimentation, but there's a certain way in which that can become a negative if we overly focus on not the process whereby sedimentation occurs, but as though it has always already occurred and merely was sedimented. Because then we are in this stage where Deleuze is very vocal about this, like in dialogues and negotiations and these interviews that are a little bit more informal, but he talks about sort of, we were the last generation, he's talking about his generation of thinkers, we were the last generation to be sort of like bludgeoned by the history of philosophy. He bemoans this fact that, like, how can you do philosophy if you haven't read this, that, or the other thinker and this, that, or the other book on this thinker? So there's a certain way in which that sedimentation could become oppressive in its institutionalization, or the word that Husserl uses is traditionalization. But Husserl doesn't himself merely focus on that structural element, right? He is talking about how there is an ability to sort of reactivate, I think is another word he used.
Yeah.
And so traditionalization is not the tradition with a capital T. It is a process that is worked on and worked through. So we're not passively inheriting sort of what came before. It's just that there is, and it's the same with geometry. I was thinking about this when I was reading The Origins of Geometry. One of the things is, like, insofar as there is this reactivation of the tradition that's inherited, right? We don't have to rework through all of the shit. We'd never get anything done in geometry or philosophy or whatnot if we had to go through all the motions. So yes, there is a positive sense in this, but you know, one of the things too, insofar as we can reactivate the tradition, thinkers like mathematicians like Riemann, Lobachevsky, et cetera, can look at like Euclid who is like the holy fucking prophet of geometry, and suspend that fifth postulate about the parallel lines never meeting in infinity, and say, what if this imposition actually restricted the possibilities of thinking a curved universe? So I think that Husserl himself is very careful in choosing his words, even if it may seem he is sort of emphasizing the tradition or the sediment. If we move a little too quickly, we might just see him as a kind of justifier of things are the way they are. And I don't think that I think that's a bad reading. And I think that he may not emphasize so much the creative possibilities, but I think just that one example about non-Euclidean geometry can extend to the other sciences and to philosophy itself. Obviously, like in the 20th century, with something like Kuhn and this notion of paradigm shifts, however much one wants to buy into that, that at least gives like a kind of loose image of what I'm talking about. But I don't think it has to be restricted to that. It's just that even the sciences, through this unprecedented whatnot, whether it be a discovery or, again, reactivating, going back to, like in mathematics, going back to Euclid and saying, actually, there's something amiss. Or at the very least, that fifth postulate worked very fine for 2 millennia without hindering, so to speak, the movement of the sciences and of mathematics. It worked very fine in a universe that is not curved.
I like that example, and I wish I knew what Husserl's take is exactly on how to think about Euclidean versus non-Euclidean geometry, and how that would feed back into this discussion of the origin of geometry and being able to reactivate. Because he is really emphatic here. Well, like he does want to say, yes, there's novelty, but you're right to say that in that essay, there's a real conservative emphasis on reactivation and how there's been an emptying of sense so that we manipulate symbols without really knowing what we're doing, and to correct them back and reactivate the primal experiences of the original geometers. And here's a point where Merleau-Ponty, there's still going to be some friction between him and Deleuze, but where he takes a very different direction from Husserl, that I think, like Husserl, once legitimate valid sense has been instituted, it carries on. Like, sure, there can be corrections, but corrections of that same idea. Whereas I think, like for Deleuze, he would want more like rupture and novelty in the process. Now, this is from Prose of the World. Merleau-Ponty does talk about geometry within the conceptual framework of Husserl's genetic phenomenology. He says that the thing that needs to be changed is like the space for novelty, and that when there's the emergence of Riemannian space, that actually he takes a kind of Hegelian approach to this, that there's kind of an Aufhebung, that in some sense the Riemannian geometry does incorporate and lift up at the same time what's going on in Euclidean geometry. But it's a thorough transformation, even though it's not as if the elements picked up and preserved from Euclid remain the same as they were, plus some extras. Within the new system, everything takes on a new kind of value. And maybe this is also like connects with a broader affinity with Deleuze and phenomenology from this genetic point of view, is that, Taylor, you mentioned earlier the completion of the system of German idealism.
Yeah.
For phenomenology, there is no completion of the system, and that's not even a goal.
It's not a problem. It's a false problem or something like this. There's the familiar thing that the famous remark of Merleau-Ponty's in the introduction to the phenomenology of perception, there's no such thing as complete phenomenological reduction. Even Husserl is willing to say that there are infinite avenues of extension of what phenomenology is up to. It's not going to yield some closed system that then like it just becomes a refinement of. Merleau-Ponty, I think, would go even further
that every time you approach philosophy, you have to reconceptualize it in a way that's idiosyncratic, that like whoever's going to carry on Husserl's phenomenology cannot do it in his precise vocabulary with his precise conceptuality and still be true to like going back to the things themselves. So there's this openness and room for variation. Merleau-Ponty much more so than Husserl, but for both of them, there's no system they're trying to produce and complete.
I think that the dream of a complete system is a 19th century dream, right? You see this too in mathematics with Russell and Whitehead trying to sort of put mathematics on a footing that could render it complete and consistent. And we see how Gödel shows that to be kind of a false problem, that kind of aspiration and dream is no longer valid or no longer should be validated. You know, there are these undecidable truths of the system. The axioms cannot contain everything. So, but that can be, instead of seeing that as a deficiency to be solved or a problem, it sort of opens up the space for other undertakings and endeavors. That's like where I feel someone like Bergson is very helpful sometimes when we consider the fact that if we reduce philosophy or even the sciences to merely the question of the truth and falsehood of solutions, we might be led astray by false problems, by these fake problems that our solutions are determined for Deleuze at least, but I think we could extend this out based on how we determine the problem. So if we focus on these false problems, then we really are expending energy that could be put elsewhere. I think that's one of the interesting things when Husserl is going through these hypothetical objections and trying to counter them ahead of time. He's seeing, with the Thales of geometry example, he's seeing that as a false problem. That's a problem that doesn't concern us and that's not actually very interesting.
I'm glad you bring it back there in relation to this idea that maybe there's a kind of false problem here. Because I think the way that Husserl poses what he's up to in this text, I've definitely played this side of it up, is it seems like there's a clash between what he wants to say and the Copernican view. But he is actually not rejecting the Copernican view. He says that it's legitimate, but that it has limited validity. And then he doesn't expound on what that means. Yeah. But surely one thing that it means is that it is correct and true when you're thinking in natural scientific terms to say that the Earth moves. And so that when Husserl says the Earth doesn't move, yeah, he's voicing a profound difference in ways of conceiving and experiencing the Earth, but it's not exactly a contradiction or an opposition. What he really wants to do is to say, hey, don't take like all of these scientific idealizations and read them back into your experience. Don't falsify all of the other ways that we have of relating to the world in that kind of way.
Don't do that, but don't take it so far that then you say the Earth is flat.
Yeah.
unless you mean it in a genetic phenomenological way and can sort of, you know, provide some good reasons for asserting that. Because again, that's the thing. When, as Coop brought up earlier, you know, saying the Earth is flat is meant as a scientifically verifiable statement. Husserl saying the Earth does not move, he's not speaking in Copernican language. He's not competing with Copernicus on that point. He's speaking in we could even use the broader term that sort of Hegel popularized. He's almost speaking speculatively rather than
sometimes. No, go ahead.
Than scientifically, than astrophysically, quote unquote.
Well, sometimes I wonder if it's not as simple. So, like, I haven't fully worked out what I think. Like, what is the dispute between Husserl and the Copernican framework? When he says the Earth doesn't move, but the Copernican says it does, like, how are we to understand the relationship of these claims to one another? And sometimes I wonder if it isn't like as simple as not exactly equivocation. So you could say, oh, well, maybe like there's motion in the sense that we experience it in the life world, and then there's motion as defined by natural science, and like these are just actually not the same thing. There are things that Husserl says that are friendly to that approach, but perhaps it's even simpler than that. And it's like, so like to give a simplistic analogy, imagine like we're at a table and I'm seated on one side, you're seated on the other side, and I've got my phone next to me on the table. I say like, well, like it's hard to imagine what a scenario where I'd actually say this, but the phone is to my right, or like something like that. And then you're like, well, no, it's to the left, because for you, it's on your left. When I say it's to the right, when you say it's to the left, we don't disagree. It's just that the terms we're using are defined relative to a point of reference. So then in the pre-Copernican view, all talk of motion, the meaning of it is relative to the earth ground. But then this is relaxed when you're in the Copernican view. There is no privileged point. So then like the statements don't clash because the words are used with kind of different anchorings, different points of reference.
I don't know if this would derail us too much or take us back, but I found that just going through the bits of text I pulled, I thought this is quite interesting with regard to the earth as a body without organs. If y'all will indulge me, I'll try and read this without fucking it up too bad. Is not the difficulty of the constitution of the earth as a body hopelessly exaggerated? Earth is, after all, a whole of implicit parts, each being able to be really divided off and be a body, each having its own location, and thus the earth has an inner space as a system of locations, even when conceived in a non-mathematical way, a continuum of locations in regard to a total divisibility. Thus, for the same reason, every body whatsoever, insofar as divisible, has its location from the viewpoint of parts. However, the inner and outer space of the earth form a single space, or is there something left over? Any part of the earth could move. The earth has its inner motions. Similarly, any ordinary body is not only divisible, but also has its deformations and its continual inner motions, while as a whole it can, in its own way, preserve or change its place in space. Thus, the earth has deformation and continual inner motion, etc. But how can it move as a whole? How is it conceivable? It is not as though it were firmly attached. The ground is lacking for that. Does motion, hence corporeality, make sense for the earth? Is its location in the totality of space actually a location for it? On the other hand, is the totality of space not precisely the system of locations of all bodies, which accordingly divide themselves into the implicit parts of the earth, as fragmented and movable, and into free outer bodies? What curiosities of the intuition of space at this level do we have there?
That is such an important passage. Yeah, he's raising these like seemingly devastating objections against his view, and it's a little bit hard to hear there where he breaks off from talking about the objections and where he's trying to respond to them. But it's a well-made complaint against his case here that like you can say, well, hey, like I could dig up a big chunk of the earth and like hold it up and like, look, here's a body. What are you telling me, this thing I'm standing on, which I can detach pieces of and throw around, and so they're moving? How can it be true that the earth isn't a body but it's made up of bodies? And I don't know how satisfactory his response here is, but initially what he says is like, he doesn't put it in these words, but that there's what, like if you were doing a informal logic or learning about informal fallacies in logic, they would call a fallacy of composition. I think that's the one. Basically, the idea is what's true of the parts isn't necessarily true of the whole, which like is a fair point. You can come up with numerous examples of that.
Deleuze would be copacetic with that, I believe. The composition of the body without organs is like there's not an opposition between them, but they're sort of side by side. I don't know.
It's non-totalizing, right? It's a part alongside the wholes. It's a part alongside the other parts. It's non-totalizing. It doesn't totalize the parts, and I think that's not necessarily what Husserl was saying, but again, He's not saying that explicitly,
Right.
But at the very least, it accords with what Matt was saying about that fallacy.
And then like the further objections, so we mentioned them, but we didn't walk through them. But then then the objector could say like, okay, well, fine. But like now I'm on the moon, let's say, and I'm looking at the Earth, and I'm like, dang, that's a ball. Maybe even like over time, you see it move and spin. Well, now how are you telling me I can't experience the Earth as a body? And that is for Husserl the decisive point where he says, okay, right. In that instance and similar ones, he thinks actually it might take some habituation and time. So there's an element of history here too. But even setting that aside, he says, okay, yep, then you've met the condition to say that you've experienced the Earth as a body. But also at the same time, hold on, not so fast. At the same time, what happens so that you can experience the Earth as a body is that you've taken on a new ground. Now the role that was played by the Earth as the center, now, like if you're on the moon, now it's the moon that's playing that role. The functional role of there being this ground, this Boden, that doesn't disappear at all. It just shifts. It's displaced. Yep. So while he can say, yeah, you can experience the Earth as a body, that doesn't nullify his underlying point that on condition that you view it from another ground, from another thing that quote unquote becomes the Earth.
Which would again kind of show a strange distinction between, and he gets into this with when he talks about I was born on a spaceship, and so there's a kind of territory that I treat as ground. There's a distinction between, I'm sure German has a lot of words for it, but there's that distinction between, at least in English, we could think of a distinction between Earth with a capital E, which does imply this kind of centeredness as ground, and Earth with lowercase e as though is merely, or maybe it could even be the other way around, right? Maybe Earth with a capital E is considered as a planet among other planets in the solar system, and Earth with a lowercase e is anything that grounds my experience. I think that there is where maybe some of the interesting, and obviously in German, every noun is capitalized, so you can't do this in German. But nevertheless, we can imagine other Earths that would be the ground for my experience of the universe.
You use the word territory to describe it, and I think like I kind of said in passing that like there's got to be a historical dimension to it for Husserl. Probably wouldn't suffice for me to like land on the moon, turn around, look at the Earth, and be able to say, like I experience it as a body in the way that I experience like whatever, a baseball that I throw in the air as a body. But that it would require a kind of territorialization for the reason that like we'd have to be able to like traverse it and unite multiple points of view that I have in order to get that experience of the Earth as a body. Because if you think about it from our point of view on the moon, when you look at the moon, do you experience it as a body like you do the baseball that you're holding and toss? Like, I don't know. Perhaps not without all sorts of further experiences linked together of having tracked it and charted it and experienced it from various angles and seen like it turns and all of that sort of thing. You need the history.
Well, it's interesting, right, that the way in which we experience the moon, for the most part, we think of there's the dark side of the moon, and then there's that side of the moon that's constantly like facing us. So there is something interesting about this question of the movement of terrestrial bodies of these grounds. Although I guess that really isn't as much about the moon as it is about the Earth.
Well, what about the face on the face of the moon that faces us? The man on the moon?
Is it the face of the other? This would show like the point about history again. Speaking from personal experience, I needed somebody to like point it out and what is this man on the moon I'm supposed to be seeing? And they had to be like, well, it's this feature that you're looking for. And similarly to like the constellations and the gestalts that they form.
Yeah.
That's embedded in a historical tradition. And you wouldn't expect anyone to look up at the sky and be like, oh, Big Dipper or whatever ancient Greek hero or divinity that we point up and say, ah, there it is.
Do we want to give Matt last word platform for talking about what he's working on in the present?
Oh man, I don't know if I have anything interesting to say.
Oh, okay. Well, you could have a research project or even a fantasized one.
Yeah,
that you've always wanted to do.
Yeah, I can speak on that. Yeah.
I only meant to say, like, I felt like we had a really good conversation, and no need to necessarily just try to belabor points that we may have already gone through. So I wanted to give you. We always give the guests the last word, and unless there was anything else you wanted to focus on.
No, I think we did pretty good.
Okay. So yeah, fantasy projects, I guess. What have you always sort of? There's got to be something there that you've sort of like kicked around in your mind.
My fixation for a few years has actually been on something. It's from Husserl, but it's very different from this business of the earth not moving. It's a more classic Husserlian issue. And really an elementary one of when you do the ABCs of phenomenology, like day one, let's say, you'll be given this example of, to help illustrate the idea of intentionality and perceptual intentionality in particular of, okay, you open your eyes and you gaze out upon, let's say, a humdrum example, a tissue box. And your experience has the sense of being of a box. But then, like, hold on a sec. If you really carefully describe what shows up in your experience, it's the facing surface, and there's its interior and its far sides and its underneath and all of that are
the adumbrations, right?
Yeah, the adumbration or the kind of moral of this would be that when you experience it in the horizon with an implicit awareness of all of this other stuff. So I've been in a whole bunch of articles really critical of Husserl's account for this. And I've tried to suggest that, well, I think there's something to the idea of a horizon. What I object to in Husserl is that I have an experiential awareness of other sides or the inside. This I object to. I do want to say that there's a connection and one that's understood in a way, but not kind of like in the experiential sense that Husserl suggests. I guess going forward, what I'm really hoping for a breakthrough on is that I've written all these articles that are critical of Husserl, saying like, no, you can't have it. This is wrong. This is not the right way. The most recent version of my argument, I try and say that on Husserl's account of why experience has a horizon in this way, why I can't simply see the object, but have to have this implicit, empty consciousness of its other side. I suggest that if you dig carefully here and look at what he's up to, it leads him to hold the very thing that he objects to in Kant, that basically, like, there's a thing in itself. You never simply experience it. You always experience it in a qualified kind of way. This is super simplifying the point. But at any rate, I've said all this negative stuff about Husserl, and I feel really very much indebted to trying to tell my account of how I think it is we're aware of things that does grant a kind of implicit understanding, I want to say, as opposed to awareness, an implicit understanding of the object or the thing perceived as being more than it appears in like this present time slice. But I want to, on the one hand, like keep it in a Husserlian spirit and say, like, it comes down to abilities. When I exercise an ability, or so think about like playing a sport or something like that. When I'm in the middle of the game, I'm exercising a kind of competence and I'm ready to engage in the situation in numerous kinds of ways. Am I aware? Am I conscious of all of those possible engagements? I don't think that that's what it means to be able to intervene and to be participating. I think that I have an understanding and I could make it explicit. That understanding informs what I'm doing at a given moment. But I don't want to say I'm like aware of it in the sense that Husserl wants to say there's a quasi-sensory, there's an important distinction because it's empty, but I literally experience the other side of the object. I experience all of those other possibilities. I don't think so. I don't think that that's what understanding involves. So maybe not as polemical and kind of out there in left field as the Earth doesn't move type of business. But coming back to fundamental questions in phenomenology that honestly have been kind of taken as a starting point by most phenomenologists and
Right.
not really questioned, with some tweaking here and there. But to go back to the very beginning with Levinas, this is one of the things that excites me about Levinas is when he talks about enjoyment and sensibility, he says it has this kind of naivete of not having this kind of sense of possibilities projected all around it. It's
Right.
both anti-Heideggerian and anti-Husserlian. And like, yeah, I think he's right about that in a way that the rest of the phenomenological tradition has not been so correct. Merleau-Ponty I feel better about than the rest, but yeah.
I think you're right. When you're showing competence in a sport or something like this, you aren't self-consciously cogitating about trajectories, launch angles for your bat, and you might be considering possibilities of which pitch you're going to see next, but they remain abstract. And to a certain extent, if you're in your head, you're not in your hands. If you think about swinging a bat or something like this. I also think about the experience of fucking. If you're thinking too much about the activity of fucking when you're fucking, you get to an absurd, it's kind of silly. It's the post-nut clarity, but before nutting, right? If you have that post-nut clarity before nutting, you're like, why am I doing this awkward thing? Unless you strictly are like a conservative traditionalist Christian and thinking like, babies, sure, you could have a T list to it, but
I mean, there's that concept of muscle memory, right? Where you kind of like are acting on a sort of, I don't know what you would call that kind of, has an interesting question with relationship to phenomenology, I think, but that's out of my depth. But
No,
right, like how does that implies a historical, at least portion.
I can connect the dots between the point about muscle memory and Merleau-Ponty's account of perception in the phenomenology of perception, where a big part of how perception functions is on the ground of a kind of pre-personal, non-conscious bodily structure.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that was quite well.
I think it was Taylor was saying that Simondon was a student of Merleau-Ponty's, right?
That's right.
I was talking about how Simondon is the one who inspires kind of Deleuze to pursue, if you will, the underside of Merleau-Ponty, right? If Merleau-Ponty is thinking through the flesh and its constitution, Deleuze and Simondon are trying to explore like the pre-individual singularities that would go into the process of individuation. So it's I don't want to say it's a contradiction or trying to like do the opposite, but they are, if you schematize it, they're on different extremes to a certain extent if we consider the individual or individuation as a criterion. And the extent to which Simondon is inspired to go down that path because of Merleau-Ponty, I think that case can be made, and I would love to see more literature on it because I haven't read a lot about Simondon and Deleuze, but not very much about Simondon and Merleau-Ponty, and that could be partly Simondon's fault for not really talking about his teacher.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection there with the kind of pre-individual. I was scanning through before we met today the now I'm forgetting which, I think it was in the visible and the invisible, but I guess now I'm uncertain, so don't quote me on it. But he makes this distinction between like identity that happens at the level of reflective, discursive thinking. And then he wants to say there's a more fundamental level of our experience, or an independent one at any rate. Like this is where like we're locating the earth as ground and all of that, where he says we can't apply the notion of identity, but rather he uses the German word Einigung or something like that. He means a unity that doesn't involve individuality when he says that.
Interesting. Is that Stirner's Einzige?
Right? Who knows? Could very well be. I don't know. We'll have to find out whenever we get you to read The Unique in Its Property.
Maybe we can do that for next week. Maybe that's what we'll do. We'll do some Stirner. As you can see, the sun's going down. I don't have the light on in here, so I'm.
Yeah, where the heck are you?
You're painting black on black. What the fuck?
I've got the cigarette. This is where I am right here. This is my consciousness.
I'm perceiving something. I don't know what it is.
No, this was great. Matt, thanks for coming on, man. And it was good to see you again. I really enjoyed hanging out with you at Coop's last November. So it was really nice. And I assume I'll be coming down to visit Coop here in the next few months. We try to do a yearly thing. So if there's a way we can get you to come by again.
Yeah, maybe we can do an in-person recording or something.
I mean, that'd be great to have a couple more beers and we could fuck around, play some more Nintendo games. I know we played
Jeopardy.
I told my friend the other day that when I was hanging out I was telling him I was like, yeah, we're recording with somebody I've met before, which is kind of rare, I think.
Yeah, totally, right? In the flesh.
Beyond Coop, obviously. Yeah, in the flesh, right? And I was saying, like, yeah, we emulated the Nintendo Jeopardy, and it was actually really hard because a lot of those questions are fucking dated, man.
Yeah, they beat our ass.
Yeah, it was
the NPCs.
It was tough. But anyway, thanks again for spending time with us and walking us through Husserl. I think we're continuing to kind of diversify our assets here on the Machine and Conscious Happy Hour. Doing some Hegel and some Husserl, and we've done
Hegel.
We did some elements of the philosophy of right last.
The philosophy of right of all texts. Okay.
Yeah. Well, we had to go left field on it, man. And you can't. What are you going to do? The phenomenology for the 100th time? No, we gotta.
No.
Yeah, we gotta.
You made the right.
Well, see, it's good because so we have to know what property is for Hegel so that we can really delve into the unique and its property. Because Stirner is really working in that framework.
We had to understand Eigentum is the word for property in German. So we had to understand Hegel, at least in the abstract right chapter, that first chapter, in order to start Stirner. I felt that was the right course, and so I'm excited to finally do Stirner. Coop's been.
Then you could get real fucked up and go to later Heidegger, where he likes to talk about the Ereignis.
Right. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's that same and he stresses that root in there,
the the one or the unique or whatever.
Yeah, some people say en owning, some people say appropriation, but here the propri from property, similar kind of root.
Right. Okay.
Oh, interesting.
Gotcha.
Nice.
Get real nuts.
I mean, is Ereignis also loosely translated as event?
Yeah.
Is that not right? Okay. See, that just tells you the whole philological aspect of Heidegger is totally fucked, right? You in owning, that was the original translation and what the contributions to philosophy, which everybody says is terrible, at least it's an initial translation. Anyway, we'll pick this up at a certain point, and maybe I'll let you know when Coop and I make those travel plans so that we can give you a heads up and make
hit me up
that we all get to hang out again.
Well, nice talking with you guys. Thanks for having me on.
Likewise.
Right on.
We'll see you on the Twitter app. But once again, thanks to Matt for joining us on this week's edition of the Machine of Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure bias without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork or